In the early 1950s, as the Cold War's ideological front lines hardened beyond Europe and Asia, Guatemala emerged as an unexpected focal point of superpower anxiety, not because of its military strength or geopolitical position, but because its internal political evolution challenged assumptions about control, alignment, and precedent in the Western Hemisphere. And it was within this context that Operation PBSuccess took shape as a covert campaign designed to remove a government deemed intolerable to U.S. strategic interests without the overt use of force. The roots of the crisis lay in Guatemala's post-war transformation, which began in 1944 with the overthrow of a long-standing authoritarian regime and the inauguration of a decade of reformist governance known domestically as the 10 Years of Spring, a period marked by expanded political participation, labor organization, and efforts to modernize an economy dominated by landed elites and foreign corporations. This transformation accelerated under the presidency of Jacobo Árbenz, who took office in 1951 with a mandate to pursue structural reform, most notably through agrarian redistribution, aimed at dismantling the concentration of land ownership that had left the majority of the rural population landless and economically marginalized. Árbenz's reform agenda, while rooted in domestic conditions and framed as nationalist rather than revolutionary, intersected with Cold War perceptions in ways that proved decisive, as land expropriation affected foreign-owned holdings and the legalization of communist political participation raised alarms in Washington at a moment when U.S. policymakers were increasingly inclined to interpret social reform through the lens of ideological subversion. The most consequential of these intersections involved the United Fruit Company, a powerful U.S.-based corporation whose extensive landholdings, transportation infrastructure, and political influence in Guatemala made it both a direct target of agrarian reform and an effective conduit for framing the Guatemalan government as a threat to hemispheric stability. The expropriation of unused United Fruit lands under Árbenz's land reform law was compensated according to declared tax values, a legalistic but politically explosive move that the company and its allies portrayed as confiscation, reinforcing narratives in Washington that Guatemala was drifting toward communism and required decisive action. These narratives gained traction within an American foreign policy establishment, already shaped by the experience of post-war containment and the belief that perceived weakness or inaction in one theater could invite challenges elsewhere, a belief that endowed even small states with symbolic importance far exceeding their material power. Guatemala thus came to be seen not as an isolated case, but as a test of credibility, a potential precedent that could embolden similar movements across Latin America if left unchecked. And it was this logic that underpinned the decision to pursue regime change through covert means rather than diplomacy or overt intervention. The Central Intelligence Agency, operating under directives that emphasized deniability and speed, began planning a campaign that would combine psychological warfare, political pressure, and limited paramilitary action to create the appearance of an internal uprising and to fracture the loyalty of Guatemala's military, whose support was understood to be the decisive factor in any outcome. Operation PBSuccess was conceived not as a traditional military invasion, but as an exercise in perception management, premised on the idea that sufficient fear, confusion, and uncertainty could collapse a government without the need for sustained combat. This approach reflected broader Cold War assumptions about the power of psychological operations and the vulnerability of states undergoing rapid social change, assumptions reinforced by intelligence assessments that portrayed Árbenz as isolated, indecisive, and dependent on a narrow coalition that could be disrupted through targeted pressure. Planning accelerated through 1953 and early 1954, as U.S. officials concluded that diplomatic avenues were unlikely to reverse Guatemala's course, and that the presence of a small but legally recognized communist party within the governing coalition constituted an unacceptable risk, regardless of its actual influence. The decision to act covertly rather than overtly was shaped by both international and domestic considerations, including sensitivity to Latin American opinion, the desire to avoid direct violation of the principle of non-intervention, and confidence that a carefully orchestrated operation could achieve results quickly and quietly. Neighboring Honduras was selected as a staging ground, providing geographical proximity, political cooperation, and plausible deniability, while a relatively obscure Guatemalan exile officer, Carlos Castillo Armas, was identified as a suitable figurehead whose leadership could lend the operation a veneer of indigenous legitimacy. Castillo Armas's military credentials and opposition to the Árbenz government made him a useful instrument, even as planners privately acknowledged his limited capacity to command broad support or to sustain power independently. The core of PBSuccess lay not in the size or strength of the forces assembled, but in the orchestration of an information environment designed to convince Guatemalans, and especially the armed forces, that resistance was futile and that the United States was prepared to escalate if necessary. Radio broadcasts, leaflets, diplomatic signals, and selective acts of sabotage were integrated into a campaign intended to magnify the apparent strength of the opposition and to suggest the inevitability of regime change. This emphasis on perception over force reflected an understanding that the Guatemalan military, though not ideologically committed to Árbenz's reforms, remained wary of direct confrontation with the United States and susceptible to psychological pressure that framed the crisis as a choice between national survival and catastrophic isolation. As the operation moved from planning to execution in mid-1954, these dynamics converged into a situation of acute tension, in which the Guatemalan government faced not a conventional invasion, but a mounting sense of encirclement, uncertainty, and abandonment. Conditions deliberately cultivated to undermine confidence and cohesion at the highest levels of the state. Operation PBSuccess thus unfolded as a prototype of Cold War covert action, demonstrating how intelligence, propaganda, and limited paramilitary force could be combined to achieve strategic objectives without formal declarations of war, and setting in motion consequences that would extend far beyond Guatemala itself, reshaping U.S. policy in Latin America and establishing a precedent for intervention whose effects would reverberate for decades. As the operation entered its execution phase in June 1954, the gap between the modest material strength of the anti-Árbenz forces and the scale of the crisis they generated revealed the extent to which Operation PBSuccess was designed to function as an intelligence-driven psychological assault rather than a conventional coup, exploiting uncertainty and institutional weakness to induce collapse from within. The paramilitary component assembled around Carlos Castillo Armas numbered only a few hundred men, poorly equipped and unevenly trained, a force wholly inadequate to defeat the Guatemalan army in open combat. Yet planners understood that victory did not depend on battlefield success, but on persuading Guatemala's leadership that resistance would invite overwhelming retaliation and international isolation. To achieve this effect, the CIA coordinated a sustained psychological warfare campaign that fused rumor, intimidation, and the selective display of force into a narrative of inevitability, carefully calibrated to erode confidence within the military command while avoiding actions that might unify the population around the government. Radio broadcasts played a central role in this strategy, as clandestine transmitters operating under the name Voice of Liberation reported fictitious rebel victories, exaggerated the size of the invading force, and implied the existence of widespread internal defections, creating an atmosphere in which information itself became unreliable and fear filled the gaps left by uncertainty. These broadcasts were reinforced by leaflets dropped from aircraft, diplomatic signaling that suggested tacit U.S. endorsement of regime change, and the visible movement of small rebel units across the border, all designed to blur the distinction between rumor and reality, and to convince observers that events were spiraling beyond the government's control. Limited air operations, including sporadic bombing and strafing runs, were conducted less for their military impact than for their psychological effect, targeting symbolic infrastructure and urban areas to demonstrate reach and to suggest the presence of a more substantial force than actually existed. These actions heightened anxiety in the capital and underscored the government's inability to protect its own airspace, a vulnerability that carried disproportionate weight in a country unaccustomed to aerial attack. Within the Guatemalan High Command, the effect of this campaign was corrosive, as officers struggled to distinguish credible intelligence from manufactured signals and to assess the true balance of power, all while confronting the prospect that continued loyalty to Árbenz might draw the country into direct confrontation with the United States. This fear was not unfounded, as U.S. diplomatic behavior and regional posture were deliberately ambiguous, encouraging the perception that escalation would be swift and decisive if the government resisted. President Árbenz, increasingly isolated, faced a dilemma shaped by these pressures, as his commitment to constitutional process and a reluctance to arm civilian supporters limited his options at a moment when decisive action might have altered the outcome. While his reliance on the military as the ultimate guarantor of authority proved increasingly precarious as that institution weighed its own survival against loyalty to the elected government. Efforts to rally international support through diplomatic channels failed to generate immediate relief, reinforcing the sense that Guatemala stood alone against a hostile environment in which legal arguments carried little weight. Within days, the cumulative effect of psychological pressure began to outweigh the actual military threat, as key officers hesitated to engage the rebel force aggressively, citing uncertainty about U.S. intentions and the risk of catastrophic escalation. This hesitation created a self-reinforcing cycle, as inaction was interpreted by others as evidence of impending defeat, further weakening morale and cohesion. The decisive moment came not through a major battle, but through the erosion of confidence at the top of the state, as Árbenz concluded that continued resistance would likely result in bloodshed without altering the strategic balance, and that his resignation might spare the country a more violent outcome. On 27 June 1954, Árbenz stepped down, transferring power to military leaders who quickly moved to negotiate with Castillo Armas, a transition that unfolded with remarkable speed given the scale of the political transformation involved. The rapidity of this collapse underscored the effectiveness of the operation's design, validating the assumption that psychological warfare could substitute for conventional force when applied against a government whose legitimacy depended on institutions vulnerable to external pressure. The immediate aftermath saw the swift dismantling of the reformist coalition that had sustained the 10 years of Spring, as communist organizations were outlawed, labor movements suppressed, and land reforms reversed, signaling a decisive break with the trajectory that had provoked intervention. For the CIA and its political sponsors, PBSuccess was hailed internally as a model operation, demonstrating that covert action could achieve strategic objectives efficiently and with plausible deniability, reinforcing confidence in similar methods elsewhere. Yet the apparent success masked deeper consequences, as the removal of Árbenz resolved a perceived Cold War threat, while inaugurating a period of repression and instability that would reshape Guatemala's political landscape for decades, raising questions about the long-term costs of intelligence-driven regime change, even as it appeared to vindicate short-term strategic logic. Operation PBSuccess thus revealed the power of perception as a weapon, illustrating how control of information, fear of escalation, and manipulation of institutional loyalties could bring down a government without a decisive battle, and setting a precedent that would profoundly influence the conduct of covert operations throughout the Cold War. In the wake of Árbenz's resignation, the transition engineered by Operation PBSuccess moved rapidly from covert destabilization to overt consolidation, revealing how intelligence-driven coups required immediate political restructuring to prevent reversal and to translate psychological collapse into durable control, and the speed with which this phase unfolded underscored the extent to which the operation had anticipated not only regime removal, but the management of its aftermath. The Guatemalan military junta that briefly assumed authority acted swiftly to neutralize potential resistance, suspending constitutional guarantees, arresting perceived sympathizers of the previous government, and signaling alignment with the forces that had precipitated the collapse, a sequence that cleared the path for Carlos Castillo Armas to enter the capital and be installed as head of state with external backing. This installation was framed domestically and internationally as the outcome of an internal liberation rather than a foreign-imposed change, a narrative carefully cultivated to preserve the principle of non-intervention, while masking the degree to which the outcome had been orchestrated from outside. Castillo Armas's regime moved quickly to dismantle the institutional and legal foundations of the 10 Years of Spring, repealing agrarian reform, dissolving labor organizations, and purging the civil service and armed forces of individuals associated with reformist or leftist politics, actions justified as necessary measures to restore order and protect Guatemala from subversion. These measures, while stabilizing the new government in the short term, also marked the beginning of a pattern in which political exclusion and repression became central tools of governance, narrowing the space for lawful opposition and entrenching a security-centric state. The United States, having achieved its immediate objective, shifted from covert action to overt support, providing diplomatic recognition, economic assistance, and security cooperation designed to stabilize the new regime and to demonstrate the benefits of alignment, reinforcing the perception that the coup had restored Guatemala to the acceptable bounds of hemispheric order. This support extended beyond Guatemala itself, as the success of PBSuccess was interpreted within Washington as validation of a broader strategy of covert intervention in the Western Hemisphere, strengthening the conviction that early, decisive action could prevent perceived threats from maturing into more formidable challenges. The operation's apparent efficiency and deniability contributed to a sense of institutional confidence within the intelligence community, encouraging the expansion of covert action capabilities, and the belief that complex political environments could be managed through carefully calibrated manipulation of information and force. This confidence, however, rested on a narrow definition of success that prioritized regime change over long-term stability, overlooking the ways in which the destruction of reformist institutions and the empowerment of coercive actors sowed the seeds of future conflict. Within Guatemala, the reversal of reforms and the repression of political participation fractured society, pushing opposition movements underground and fostering conditions in which violence would later become the primary means of contestation, a trajectory that transformed the country into a site of prolonged internal conflict rather than durable alignment. The immediate post-coup period thus revealed the paradox at the heart of PBSuccess, as an operation designed to prevent instability in the short term contributed to the erosion of political legitimacy and institutional resilience over the long term, illustrating how Cold War interventions often substituted control for consent. Regionally, the coup reverberated across Latin America, sending a clear signal that governments pursuing reforms perceived as threatening to U.S. interests could face covert removal regardless of electoral legitimacy, a signal that shaped the behavior of political elites and military institutions throughout the hemisphere. This demonstration effect extended beyond the Americas, reinforcing the belief among both allies and adversaries that the United States possessed both the capability and the willingness to intervene indirectly to shape political outcomes, a belief that would influence Cold War dynamics in diverse contexts. Within the intelligence community, PBSuccess became a reference point, cited in internal discussions as evidence of what could be achieved through psychological warfare, proxy forces, and the manipulation of elite perceptions, embedding a template that emphasized speed, deniability, and the exploitation of institutional vulnerabilities. Yet, even as it was celebrated as a model, the operation exposed fundamental tensions between covert action and democratic principles, tensions that would resurface repeatedly as similar methods were applied elsewhere, with varying degrees of success and unintended consequence. The consolidation of Castillo Armas's regime thus marked not an endpoint, but a transition, as the immediate crisis gave way to a new political order shaped by exclusion, dependency, and the constant invocation of internal and external threats, conditions that would define Guatemala's trajectory for decades. Operation PBSuccess, in this phase, demonstrated that removing a government was only the first step in a longer process of reordering society, and that the intelligence tools capable of engineering collapse were far less adept at constructing legitimacy or addressing the social conflicts that had driven reform in the first place. As the Cold War intensified, the lessons drawn from Guatemala would inform subsequent interventions, reinforcing a strategic culture that favored covert manipulation over engagement, and that measured success in terms of immediate outcomes rather than durable peace. A culture whose imprint would be felt long after the specific operation had faded from public view. As the Cold War context deepened in the latter half of the 1950s, the long-term implications of Operation PBSuccess became increasingly apparent, revealing how a covert operation that achieved rapid regime change also restructured political incentives in ways that entrenched instability and normalized repression as instruments of state power, not only within Guatemala, but across the broader strategic imagination of U.S. policy toward the developing world. The Castillo Armas government, lacking a broad social base and dependent on military support, governed through exclusion and coercion, relying on emergency measures, surveillance, and the systematic marginalization of political opponents to maintain control, a pattern that reflected both internal weakness and the external logic of Cold War alignment. Agrarian reform was dismantled, land returned to elites and foreign corporations, and labor protections rolled back, reversing the material gains of the previous decade and reasserting an economic order that prioritized stability over redistribution. Yet these reversals did not resolve the underlying inequalities that had driven reformist politics in the first place. Instead, they displaced conflict from the institutional arena into informal and eventually violent channels, as avenues for lawful opposition were closed and grievances accumulated without means of redress. The Guatemalan military, elevated by the coup from an arbiter of order to the central pillar of governance, expanded its role in politics and internal security, embedding itself as the ultimate guarantor of the post-coup order and reinforcing a cycle in which political authority flowed from control of force rather than electoral legitimacy. This militarization of politics was reinforced by external support, as U.S. military assistance and training programs emphasized counterinsurgency and internal security, reflecting a growing conviction that stability in the hemisphere depended on strong security institutions capable of suppressing subversion rather than on inclusive political systems. These assumptions, shaped by the perceived success of PBSuccess, contributed to a regional security doctrine that privileged preemption and control, encouraging military establishments across Latin America to view themselves as guardians against ideological threat and to intervene directly in politics when civilian governments appeared insufficiently reliable. Within Guatemala, the consequences of this doctrine unfolded gradually but inexorably as political repression deepened and cycles of violence escalated, transforming the country into a theater of internal conflict that would endure for decades and impose profound human costs. The link between these outcomes and the 1954 coup was not immediate but structural, as the destruction of reformist institutions and the empowerment of coercive actors created conditions in which armed opposition emerged as one of the few remaining avenues for contestation. Internationally, the operation's legacy extended into the strategic calculations of both allies and adversaries, as the success of PBSuccess reinforced the belief that covert action could serve as a substitute for diplomacy or development in managing perceived threats, a belief that would shape interventions in other regions with varying results. Within the United States, debates about the ethical and strategic implications of such operations remained largely confined to internal channels, overshadowed by a broader consensus that the Cold War required decisive action to prevent ideological expansion, even at the cost of democratic norms. This consensus was reinforced by the absence of immediate blowback, as the rapid collapse of the Árbenz government and the installation of a compliant regime appeared to validate the operation's premises and obscure its longer-term consequences. Over time, however, Guatemala's descent into chronic violence and authoritarianism challenged this narrative, raising questions about the sustainability of security achieved through coercion and the risks inherent in conflating reform with subversion. Analytically, PBSuccess illustrates how Cold War interventions often succeeded on their own terms while failing on broader measures of stability and legitimacy, achieving short-term strategic objectives at the expense of long-term social cohesion. The operation demonstrated the power of intelligence-driven psychological warfare to reshape political outcomes, but it also exposed the limitations of such methods in addressing the structural drivers of conflict, which could not be eliminated through regime change alone. As similar operations were contemplated and executed elsewhere, the Guatemalan case served both as a template and a warning, highlighting the trade-offs embedded in covert action and the difficulty of controlling its downstream effects. In the context of the early Cold War, however, these trade-offs were often discounted, as policymakers prioritized containment and credibility over nuanced engagement, a prioritization that shaped the trajectory of U.S. involvement in the Global South for decades. The enduring significance of Operation PBSuccess thus lies not only in the events of 1954, but in the strategic culture it helped to consolidate, one that viewed political instability through the prism of ideological threat and treated covert intervention as a routine instrument of statecraft. with consequences that extended far beyond the immediate crisis and into the fabric of Cold War history itself. As the Cold War matured and patterns of intervention became institutionalized, Operation PBSuccess assumed significance beyond Guatemala as a formative episode that shaped how intelligence agencies, military planners, and political leaders conceptualized the management of perceived ideological threats, reinforcing a belief that covert action offered a flexible and deniable means of shaping political outcomes in regions where overt intervention carried unacceptable costs. This belief rested on the apparent clarity of the 1954 outcome, in which a government was removed swiftly, resistance was minimal, and international repercussions were limited, an outcome that appeared to confirm the efficacy of psychological warfare and elite manipulation as tools of statecraft. Within the U.S. intelligence community, PBSuccess was absorbed into doctrine as a demonstration of how carefully calibrated pressure could exploit institutional vulnerabilities, particularly in states where civilian authority depended on military loyalty and where fear of external escalation could override domestic legitimacy. This doctrinal influence extended into training, planning, and organizational culture, embedding assumptions about the malleability of political systems and the primacy of perception in determining outcomes, assumptions that would later be tested in more complex environments. The Guatemalan case, however, also revealed the inherent fragility of success measured solely in terms of regime change, as the absence of a broad social base for the post-coup government necessitated ongoing repression and external support, locking the country into a cycle of dependency and coercion that undermined prospects for durable stability. Over time, this cycle generated its own strategic costs, as persistent violence and governance failure in Guatemala complicated regional security and contributed to broader patterns of instability in Central America, illustrating how interventions designed to prevent the spread of influence could instead incubate long-term disorder. The legacy of PBSuccess thus intersected with evolving Cold War realities, as subsequent interventions encountered environments where psychological pressure alone proved insufficient, and where the destruction of reformist institutions produced power vacuums filled by more radical and violent actors. In retrospect, the operation exposed a critical asymmetry between the ease of inducing collapse and the difficulty of constructing legitimacy, an asymmetry that would haunt later efforts to replicate its apparent success. Within Guatemala, the erosion of political avenues for peaceful change fostered a polarization that hardened identities and normalized violence, transforming what had been a contested but functioning political system into a landscape defined by fear, militarization, and protracted conflict. This transformation underscored the limits of intelligence-led solutions to fundamentally political problems, as the tools effective at manipulating elites and institutions proved ill-suited to addressing deep social cleavages and economic inequality. Internationally, the perception of PBSuccess as a model operation reinforced a strategic culture that privileged short-term control over long-term engagement, contributing to a series of interventions that cumulatively shaped the Cold War's trajectory in the global South. These interventions varied in outcome, but shared a common logic rooted in the Guatemalan precedent, emphasizing deniability, speed, and the manipulation of perception as substitutes for sustained political investment. As the Cold War progressed, the costs of this approach became more visible, as regions subjected to repeated covert interventions experienced chronic instability, humanitarian crises, and weakened state institutions, outcomes that complicated superpower competition and eroded the legitimacy of external involvement. The Guatemalan coup thus occupies a paradoxical place in Cold War history, celebrated in its immediate aftermath as a triumph of intelligence and restraint, yet increasingly recognized over time as a catalyst for long-term violence and insecurity. Analytically, PBSuccess illustrates how the metrics of success employed during the early Cold War diverged sharply from broader measures of political health, reflecting a strategic environment in which containment and credibility eclipsed considerations of governance and social cohesion. This divergence was not accidental but structural, shaped by the urgency of ideological competition and the belief that failure to act decisively in one case would invite challenges elsewhere, a belief that endowed even small states with disproportionate strategic weight. As historians reassess the operation, it becomes clear that PBSuccess was less an isolated covert action than a foundational episode in the construction of a Cold War interventionist paradigm, one that fused intelligence, psychological warfare, and proxy politics into a durable model of influence. The consequences of this paradigm would unfold unevenly across decades and regions, but its origins can be traced to the assumptions validated in Guatemala in 1954. The enduring significance of Operation PBSuccess, therefore, lies not only in the overthrow of a single government, but in the way it reshaped expectations about what intelligence could achieve and at what cost, embedding a legacy that would reverberate through subsequent Cold War interventions and leaving behind a cautionary example of how success defined narrowly can obscure the deeper dynamics of conflict and instability. In its final historical balance, Operation PBSuccess stands as one of the most consequential early Cold War interventions, precisely because it demonstrated how intelligence, perception, and deniability could be mobilized to achieve decisive political change while simultaneously obscuring the long-term consequences of that change, and its legacy lies less in the events of June 1954 than in the strategic assumptions it validated and the patterns of behavior it normalized. The overthrow of Guatemala's elected government resolved an immediate concern within Washington about precedent and credibility, reinforcing the belief that reformist nationalism could be managed through covert action before it hardened into something more resistant to pressure. Yet this belief rested on a narrow conception of stability that equated alignment with order and discounted the structural effects of repression and exclusion. By dismantling institutions capable of mediating social conflict and elevating coercive power as the primary mechanism of governance, the post-coup order transformed political competition into a security problem, a transformation that would shape Guatemala's trajectory through decades of violence and fracture without delivering the durable stability the operation had ostensibly sought to secure. The apparent success of PBSuccess thus masked a deeper failure, as the methods that induced rapid collapse proved incapable of constructing legitimacy or addressing the inequalities that had driven reform, revealing an asymmetry between the ease of disruption and the difficulty of reconstruction that would recur throughout the Cold War. Within the intelligence and policy communities, however, the operation's immediate outcomes carried disproportionate weight, embedding a confidence in covert action that would inform subsequent decisions and contribute to a broader interventionist paradigm in which perception management and elite manipulation were treated as reliable substitutes for political engagement. This paradigm, forged in the early Cold War's atmosphere of urgency and fear of ideological contagion, prioritized speed and deniability over sustainability, encouraging a style of statecraft that could remove governments but rarely resolved the conflicts that made them vulnerable. Guatemala became an early illustration of how such interventions could stabilize alignments while destabilizing societies, producing regimes that endured through force and external support rather than consent, and sowing the conditions for prolonged internal conflict that would eventually impose far greater human and strategic costs than those the operation had been designed to avoid. As the Cold War unfolded, the lessons drawn from PBSuccess would be applied unevenly and often uncritically, shaping interventions in diverse contexts where local dynamics differed markedly from those in Guatemala. Yet the underlying assumption remained constant, that the manipulation of perception and power at the elite level could reliably determine political outcomes. In retrospect, this assumption underestimated the resilience of social grievances and overestimated the capacity of coercion to deliver lasting order, a miscalculation whose effects became increasingly visible as the Cold War progressed and as regions subjected to repeated interventions struggled to escape cycles of violence and fragility. Operation PBSuccess thus occupies a critical place in Cold War history, not merely as a successful coup, but as a formative episode in the evolution of covert intervention as a tool of superpower competition, illustrating both its tactical effectiveness and its strategic limitations. Its enduring significance lies in the way it reshaped the boundaries of acceptable action, lowering the threshold for intervention while raising the long-term costs of governance by force, and in doing so, it revealed a central paradox of the Cold War, that efforts to impose order through secrecy and speed often produced instability that persisted long after the immediate threat had been removed. In this sense, the Guatemalan coup of 1954 was not simply an event, but a turning point in how power was exercised in the shadow of ideological rivalry, leaving behind a legacy that would reverberate across continents and decades, and underscoring how the intelligence war of the early Cold War shaped not only outcomes, but the very logic by which those outcomes were pursued.